Hello and welcome to the Great Shrimp Shoal. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to cover all the tanks that I have had so far in the shoal, and we're going to go over some of the pitfalls that I have overcome. Thank you for showing up, and please remember to like and subscribe on your way in because I've got shrimp to take care of and mouths to feed. The first tank I'm going to go over is only due to the fact that it is in chronological order and I am going back as far as I have footage for, and that would be the garden. And this was my first shrimp tank. What's most interesting is that I did not really start filming until I thought that the tank was ready. And that means that the carpeting plants that I had planted, which ended up being the Hygrophila polysperma, ended up growing very quickly into long, stocky plants. And I actually still have some of the plants that grew up in the garden planted in both the forest and the mountains, which we'll get to soon enough. This red cherry shrimp I still have to this day, and she lives in the forest right now. And actually, she's starting to get up there in age. She's a lot more spry when I look back at the photos and the videos that I have from this time period. The filter I have long gotten rid of, as well as the lantern decoration and the substrate. And I have to tell you, when I cleaned this tank out and prepared it for the snails, which were eventually also gotten rid of, the substrate stunk quite a bit. Now, this is before I decided on putting snails in any of my tanks, and that led to some algae buildup, which resulted in the need to clean the tank on a far more frequent basis than I should have needed. This is the lantern decoration that I am very glad I got rid of. If I had to say one thing is the most important when it comes to keeping dwarf shrimp, I think that water quality would come first. But a very close second would be proper decorations. It does seem odd, but this lantern turned into a hiding spot that made viewing the shrimp much more difficult. It was also hard to clean, and when the shrimp died, they somehow found their way into the lantern first, so it led to a huge issue with poop and dead shrimp being stuck in there for weeks on end. To be honest, it was probably a progressive problem because one thing does lead to another, and then you probably have a huge ammonia cloud just hanging around the inner part of the lantern. When I did finally remove it from the tank and cleaned it just before I decided to get rid of it permanently, I can confirm that it had a horrible smell of rotten eggs. So, yeah, ammonia. Long story short, complex decorations are just a fancy place for poop and dead shrimp to pile up. Avoid them. I'm glad that I actually got to cut my teeth on this small tank. It was only 3 gallons, but it did provide me with a ton of learning experiences right off the bat. And I ended up figuring out that shrimp don't really need that many tank mates, and stuff like neon tetras and other small fish can actually stress the shrimp out and make it hard for them to breed, and goodness knows whether or not they actually eat the shrimp fry when they're born. That's pretty much it for the garden. We're going to move on to the next tank that I got, which is a basic 10-gallon tank that I ended up planting with the same substrate, moving some of the plants and planting new plants. But I also experimented with new types of filtration because I was having water quality issues that came from the garden and then moved into that tank as well. A few months after establishing the garden, I expanded into this 10-gallon tank, but the story that I told in those videos is not the complete tale. It was a good move, but the reasons for starting the 10-gallon tank were actually many and different. I had imagined it as a place to grow plants and test substrates, but things quickly snowballed out of hand. it started to look more and more like a good spot to keep the shrimp who weren't having a good time in the garden. I stocked the tank after a few weeks of cycling, and it gave the shrimp much more room to move around, so eventually I moved everyone from the garden into what would eventually be called the forest. In order to come up with that name of the forest, the rotella plants I planted there would eventually have to grow out of hand, and they wasted no time in setting down roots. They clearly liked the type of substrate that they were planted in. The graminifolia that I planted would wither and die pretty quickly, but all of the rooted plants love the fluval stratum. They also like the sea chem dark and the Carib Sea river sand. All of those made up the substrate of the forest. If I had to pick a clear winner though, especially for the shrimp tanks, it would be the fluval stratum, and that is because it comes with a host of other benefits, including, right off the bat, lowering the pH of the water. The forest was a great testbed, and it is still a solid tank right up into the time that I'm recording this video. It has gone through some swings though of its own, especially with the filtration that I was testing out. In a few months I went from using only sponge filters to using a hang-on back filter and then switching to a fairly beefy hang-on back made by Marineland. When I first started the forest, I didn't think that I needed a filter with things like biomedia or filter pads or other gimmicks, but the results speak for themselves. Even with aggressive water changes, I had issues with algae and blooms with just the sponge filters in place. It seemed that the placid water created an ideal place for the algae to grow. To be honest, if I wasn't worried about filming the shrimp, I would have probably left things to work themselves out a bit more. And I can't say that the environment that I placed the tank in didn't have something to do with those algae blooms. But after all that work, it seems as though the filters that I have now are the best choice for the forest and where it has been placed inside the shrimp room that I have. As I said, the place where this tank sits probably has a lot to do with the things like the algae growth and the temperature of the water. It's always been right by a window which has its shades pulled daily, so it does get a ton of light. In order to chase down the algae and other biological growths, I resorted to using a very fine micron-level filter with a diatomaceous earth mixture which filters out particles down to an extremely tiny size. Now, that actually might have been overkill, but it did work. These sort of polishing filters are great for removing cloudy water impurities, but they also did a pretty good job of cleaning up the biological problems too. Or at least it gave me a fighting chance, which is something that I didn't have before. Right now, the forest has just one hang-on back filter, and it has a filter compartment that I've modified to allow for a quick cleaning, as well as a custom spot for a filter pad that the filter didn't originally support, and that gets some of the smaller stuff. The pad also keeps the detritus worms to a minimum by giving them a place to get stuck, but they can still find some good food. When I clean the filter, there are invariably some detritus worms dancing at the bottom of the filter bucket, so that's always a good sign that at least things are healthy and can support a minimum of life. The forest has also given me my first chance at seeing my very own baby shrimp. The jade green shrimp and the red cherry shrimp that lived there did give birth to some young shrimplets, and I am proud to say that some of those shrimp have survived and are slowly growing up. But it would eventually take the addition of a third tank to really give a brand new colony of shrimp the chance to build what would be a better community. About 2 months after I stocked the forest tank, I decided to build a purpose-made tank that alleviated some of the issues that I had with my previous setups. I knew that I wanted to use a canister filter, and I needed something that could offer room for plants as well as a sponge filter, of sorts at least for the baby shrimp to forage on. I settled on a 30-gallon acrylic tank because it wouldn't be too much of a jump from my 10 or 3-gallon tanks, and it made sense to increment the growth that I was attempting because it would at least make it manageable, and I'd be doing something that I was already comfortable with. For the 30-gallon tank, I knew that I wanted to have a good place for the moss to grow, as well as a bunch of places for the baby shrimp to hide. The fluval stratum worked well as the only substrate, and as the dust settled, it provided lots of spaces for the roots to take hold for the aquatic plants. I spent a long time planning out the rock formations with the pieces that I had so that they could all fit into the tank and provide a diverse environment for the different types and ages of shrimp that I had. I didn't know if they would like the holes in the larger cavities in the lava rock, so it was a gamble, but it was a gamble that paid off. I've seen all the shrimp seem to love it. The moss grew well and started to grab a hold of every bit of rock that it touched. It is a slow process, and it's taken months for this moss to propagate, as it needs to be trained and trimmed. Eventually, it will cover a section of the rock like sheet moss does on a forest floor. At least, that is something that I hope for. I was worried that the bamboo shrimp would have difficulty finding stuff to eat, but they are constantly moving about and using their arms to catch stuff that I can't see, so they must be working hard. They seem to be sustaining themselves. They filter the water for food, but I've seen them scrounging around after the food pellets that I've added for the Neocaridina shrimp, so they must be able to eat something larger if they need to. The way that their fans trap particles, they could very easily catch some of the copepods that live in the tank, and I've seen copepods climbing all over the bamboo shrimp when I get a close-up shot. To be honest, even though I was jumping from 5 to 10 to 30 gallons pretty quickly, I wanted to keep things simple, so all I'm running are filters and lights on a timer. There's no fertilizer, CO2, or fancy shrimp food. Yeah, the plants would grow quicker and probably more fully, but I think that this feels a bit more natural. I've made some modification to the filters though, which I'll go over in a video soon, but they're still pretty much just filters. I named the 30-gallon tank the Mountains because of the 3 rock structures that I hoped to make the centerpieces of the environment. I really believe that every shrimp I've added to the mountains has enjoyed it, so I'll be looking to move the forest to a 30-gallon tank as well soon, so that I can extend that same benefit to the jade green cherry shrimp that live there as well. That just about covers my 3 shrimp tanks and wraps up the current state of my shrimp collection. All is right in the world of the Great Shrimp Shoal, at least for now. I'm going to try some new things though soon, so we'll have obstacles, failures, and hopefully successes just around the bend. I will be going over the individual shrimp in the next video and hopefully covering my filter setup in the near future as well. Thank you guys for showing up, and before we meet next, I hope that you have some sweet shrimpy dreams. Dream of ghost shrimp, floating cloud-colored snowball shrimp, royal jade green cherry shrimp, and the regal ruby classic cherry shrimp. Peaceful, playful, and preening shrimpy shrimp. I'll see you guys next time.